For Alina, love had once been a quiet religion. She prayed to it in private, nurtured it in daydreams, clung to it in silence, while the world around her celebrated superficialities. Raised between disappointment and emotional transactions, she had learned early that sincerity was a currency few valued. Yet she believed in fate, in soulmates, in the fantasy that somewhere between the curated lies of dating profiles and the facades of nightclubs, someone real still existed. Someone who wouldn't just want her body or beauty, but her chaos, her silence, her essence. Then came Ethan Voss. He didn't arrive like a thunderstorm. No. He came like a calm sea under a blood-red sky. Dangerous not because of what he did, but because of how seamlessly he made her feel seen. His voice, velvety and slow, seemed tuned to the frequencies of her deepest longings. His eyes never wandered. He made her feel like the only woman in a world of copies. He introduced her to a life she had only observed from the outside, where penthouse rooftops replaced bedrooms, where champagne replaced water, and where secrets dressed as success. But beneath the opulence was a hollow echo she didn't yet understand. He studied her. That was the cruelest part. Every touch, every compliment, every moment of vulnerability he shared. It wasn't affection. It was data collection. Ethan Voss was no ordinary billionaire. He was a collector of weaknesses, a master puppeteer draped in designer suits. Behind his charm lay a series of orchestrated illusions, false business ventures, romantic traps, offshore schemes cloaked in emotion. And Alina, like many before her, was just a tool, a temporary asset meant to be drained and discarded. The betrayal was surgical. Funds vanished. Contracts forged in love were revealed as financial traps. Her private images were leaked to the press, and her identity, once carefully curated, became a meme, a cautionary tale. The internet feasted on her downfall. The Oka tabloids crowned her the billionaire's fool. But something cracked inside her that day, not just from heartbreak, but from awakening. If Ethan had stripped her of everything, then he had also freed her from fear. She disappeared, not to mourn, but to molt. In the underbelly of cities that speak in shadows, from Zurich to Casablanca, she reinvented herself. She read profiles of narcissists, watched footage of cult leaders, studied the architecture of scams and psychological warfare. And in that crucible of isolation, pain gave birth to precision. Alina died. The Mistress was born. The Mistress was not a costume. She was a system. She didn't seek pity. She built blueprints of revenge, yes, but also of control. She infiltrated the same elite spheres Ethan once flaunted. This time, not as prey, but as predator. She moved through ballrooms like smoke, unseen yet unforgettable. Men fell for her just as she once fell for Ethan, but she didn't take their love. She took their leverage. Her network grew like a virus, elegant and undetected. Broken women became informants, former victims became soldiers. She taught them not to beg for justice, but to manufacture it. Ethan Voss, meanwhile, remained on his throne, blind to the erosion beneath his feet. One by one, his investors faltered. His name appeared on confidential leak lists. Anonymous tip-offs dismantled his real estate empire. His trusted inner circle began to fracture. But the Mistress was patient. She didn't want headlines. She wanted legend. Each move she made was a ghost print, each act of vengeance, a brushstroke in a larger portrait. She built her empire not from riches, but from ruins. And Ethan, for all his brilliance, could not trace the hands undoing him because he had forgotten her face. Until the night of the gala, it was a masquerade, fittingly. Under the guise of charity, Ethan basked in applause, unaware that every powerful guest in that hall had already been touched by her influence. Alina stood across the room, masked, calm, watching him smile. And for the first time, he looked uncertain. Something in the room had changed, and he couldn't name it. But she could. It was the scent of justice disguised as perfume. It was the whisper of power reclaimed. It was the moment before collapse. This is not a story of romance. It is a requiem for delusion, a hymn for those who rise not in spite of their ruin, but because of it. Alina did not return for closure. She returned to conquer and to ensure that the man who once played God would live long enough to witness his kingdom become dust. Power, in its purest form, doesn't announce itself. It whispers, it moves through shadows, behind closed doors, beneath polished smiles. Alina had learned that empires aren't built from public adoration but from secrets, and those who know how to trade in them. The world she now navigated was invisible to most, a world where loyalty was leased, where truth was manufactured, and where silence held more value than gold. The mistress understood this, and she was no longer a guest in this world. She was building a throne within it. Her first step was not to retaliate, but to observe. Revenge executed in haste is just another form of grief. She needed to erase the old self, even from memory. In Marrakesh, she acquired an identity through an exiled data broker who operated behind a spice market. In Geneva, she opened a series of shell companies under a resurrected noble name, giving herself the illusion of aristocracy. These were not just disguises, they were weapons. In a world where perception defines reality, she would become what they feared most, the unknowable. Then came the acquisitions. She didn't buy stocks or properties. She bought people. Not in the literal sense, but in the way predators buy. Silence, favor, access. A disgraced intelligence analyst, a cyber activist hunted across borders, a former madam who kept secrets for billionaires with unusual appetites. Each had been discarded. Each owed the world nothing. And the mistress offered them not redemption, but purpose. Together, they created the archive, a digital vault of blackmail, scandals, confessions, and sins buried beneath empires. Every entry was leverage. Every bite, a future collapse waiting to be triggered. She didn't need to threaten anyone. The mere possibility of being in her system was enough to instill fear in powerful men. They began to whisper her name in closed circles, unsure if she was a myth, a ghost, or something far worse. But building an empire wasn't just about fear, it was about influence. The mistress began attending secret salons hosted in forgotten chateaus, where politics met pleasure and where reputations were built on the illusion of exclusivity. She moved through these gatherings like silk, unreadable, untraceable. Every encounter was a transaction. A smile could mean surveillance. A shared glass of wine could plant a seed of doubt between allies. And in every room she entered, someone, left changed and watched. Ethan Voss, still blind to the storm forming, began experiencing disruptions. First, it was a lawsuit in Singapore tied to a phantom investor, then a scandal involving encrypted messages between his legal counsel and a Russian oligarch. Then, as if by fate, an anonymous whistleblower leaked tax records. Ethan laughed it off in public, but in private, cracks had begun to form. His inner circle, once loyal, began to splinter. No one trusted anyone. That was her design. Not to destroy him with fire, but to turn his own fortress into an implosion chamber. Meanwhile, Alina's influence began to stretch across industries. A popular influencer was exposed for promoting a fake wellness product tied to Ethan's ventures. A financial regulator received an untraceable tip, which led to a closed-door audit, and through all of it, the mistress never appeared. She wasn't on camera, she wasn't quoted, but her fingerprints were on every unraveling. This empire of hers was not born from ambition, it was born from survival. Each success was a wound repurposed, each ally a mirror of her own broken origin. She didn't offer salvation. She offered a chance to rewrite the narrative, not just for herself, but for every person who had been used, cast aside, humiliated, and still she remained alone. Power is a cold companion. It does not comfort, it does not weep. And though she sat atop a throne, built on silence and secrets, there were nights when even the mistress felt the echo of Alina stir beneath her skin. The girl who once believed, the heart that once opened, she would silence that echo. But not by forgetting, by ensuring that what had broken her would never break anyone again. In the deepest corners of her empire, beneath encrypted servers and mirrored offices, a plan was being drafted. Not just for Ethan, but for every man who had played the game of conquest, disguised as courtship. The mistress was not done. She had only just begun. And the whispers around her name were turning into tremors. What Ethan didn't know was that the war he started wasn't a battle of equals. It was a reckoning. And the woman he left behind wasn't seeking justice. She was becoming the storm. The moment revenge becomes strategic, it ceases to be emotional. That's when it becomes dangerous. For the mistress, the end of Ethan was no longer the mission. It was the door. What began as a personal vendetta had evolved into something larger. A quiet rebellion against a structure of power that thrived on secrecy, manipulation, and the consumption of the vulnerable. She had discovered that Ethan was not an anomaly. He was the template, and she, once his target, was now becoming the anomaly. The first true test of her reach came in Monaco, during a discreet fundraising soiree for a humanitarian foundation. That, in truth, funneled millions into offshore accounts. The guest list included media moguls, arms dealers disguised as philanthropists, and a Middle Eastern prince known for his ruthlessness cloaked in charm. She didn't go to make noise. She went to watch. But within hours, her presence had created ripples. Women glanced her way and lowered their voices. Men looked twice, unsure why their instincts told them to. There she met Lady Severine, a once powerful financier, blackballed after exposing her own firm's embezzlement. Severine had disappeared for 5 years, presumed mad or broken. But the mistress saw in her not fragility, but a weapon waiting to be recalled. Over 3 days, between whispered conversations and coded glances, a new alliance was formed. The mistress would offer Severine visibility and leverage. Severine would open a gate into the world of shadow banking. It wasn't just about toppling Ethan anymore. It was about dethroning a pattern. From there, the mistress orchestrated a series of subtle strikes. A notorious hedge fund executive was photographed, not with the mistress, but with confidential papers that exposed war profiteering. A celebrity billionaire was accidentally recorded making racist remarks at a closed-door summit. None of these events led back to her, but all were set in motion by quiet conversations, exchanged favors, a look held a second too long. Her name became legend. Not spoken publicly, but referenced in metaphors. The Queenmaker, the Winter Flame, the Invisible Hand. She never claimed credit. Power, real power, was not about being seen. It was about being obeyed in absentia. Ethan, still unaware of her full return, had become increasingly paranoid. His board meetings were now filled with silences, his closest allies distancing themselves. Rumors swirled that someone was dismantling his empire from within, but he couldn't find a trace. He began hiring private investigators, digital trace, teams, even dabbling in black magic rituals suggested by a desperate consultant. But the mistress had covered her tracks with religious precision. By the time he suspected her, it was already too late. The game had outgrown him. Meanwhile, Alina, the ghost within the mistress, had started writing again. Not poetry, not confessionals, but manifestos, lines written by candlelight in foreign apartments about control, identity, the seduction of silence. She wasn't simply waging war, she was documenting it, preparing for the day someone else might need a map through the same darkness. Her network now included a tech prodigy in Seoul, an exiled political strategist in Bogota, and a nun who once ran underground safe houses for women escaping violent elites. Together, they formed a cell-like structure, decentralized, invisible, efficient. Not a cult, not a corporation. Something new, something dangerous, something holy. Her empire didn't demand obedience. It offered clarity to the broken, the outcast, the betrayed. She gave not comfort, but fire. And they burned for her, because in her rage, they saw their own reflection. She wasn't their savior, she was their weapon. And yet in quiet moments, the mistress still felt the ache of the past. Not regret, but gravity. Ethan had created the wound, but she had chosen the path that followed. There were days when the power tasted like ash, nights when the faces of those she manipulated haunted the ceilings above her. But she always returned to one truth. The world she was dismantling had never offered her mercy, and so she would not return it. Now, her sights were set on something larger, not a man, not a fortune, but a symbol, a global foundation known for its rescue programs that in truth operated trafficking channels in disguise. Taking it down would require everything, every ally, every secret, every shadow she controlled, but it would mark her true evolution, from revenge to revolution. And Ethan, he was no longer the villain, he was merely the origin story, a discarded matchstick in a fire that would devour kings.
There comes a moment when revenge tastes like dust, and only transformation satisfies. For the mistress, that moment arrived the night she read the classified dossier detailing the operations of the Orion Initiative, a global organization celebrated for humanitarian work, whose inner files revealed a labyrinth of corruption. It wasn't just a front. It was an empire built on displacement, suffering, and silence. Children trafficked under the pretense of rescue, disasters manipulated to engineer financial flows. She realized then that Ethan was only the gatekeeper. This was the kingdom. Taking them down would not be an act of vengeance, it would be an act of war. The mistress understood that in this world, evil doesn't scream. It negotiates. It wears suits, smiles for cameras, donates generously. And it ensures that no one ever asks the right questions. The Orion Initiative had infiltrated governments, media, and intelligence networks. Exposing them would require more than information. It would require faith in shadows. She began the operation by activating what she called the Voiceless Ring, a network of silenced whistleblowers, each discarded by the very systems they once tried to expose. There was a former UN field agent turned alcoholic in Lisbon, a data analyst institutionalized after flagging irregularities in disaster response budgets, a journalist whose family had vanished after she questioned an orphanage's donor list. One by one, the mistress found them, listened, believed, and then offered something better than justice, a mission. Each one was given a code name, a new identity, and access to a fragment of a master plan. No one had the whole picture, except her. She knew the structure of empires was also their weakness. The more centralized the power, the more fragile the core. Meanwhile, Ethan was spiraling. His name now linked to shell companies that intersected with Orion's funding streams. He suspected sabotage but couldn't prove it. Every attempt to retaliate only exposed more of his own rot. He became what he had once feared most, irrelevant. And in his desperation, he began speaking out against the mistress in closed circles, framing her as a myth, a ghost story used to scare the powerful. But every denial only fed her legend. She used this distraction to go deeper. Through a former Orion accountant smuggled out of Kuala Lumpur, she acquired the Lotus Protocol, a secret ledger mapping the true beneficiaries of Orion's operations, royalty, tech moguls, and warlords cloaked in Western diplomacy. It was the blueprint of global hypocrisy. But releasing it would not be enough. The world had grown numb to outrage. She needed to make it personal. Her next move was theatrical. In Davos, during the World Leadership Summit, a projection appeared on the facade of the main hotel at midnight. No name, just a symbol, the black crown of the Mistress, and the words, "The forgotten are watching." Within hours, encrypted files began leaking anonymously to media outlets, investigators, and rival states. Not just evidence, but truth weaponized. What followed wasn't chaos, it was controlled collapse. Board members of the Orion Initiative began resigning. Public figures released hasty statements. Investigations were opened, and then abruptly closed. But the cracks had formed, and in the silence, people began to ask, who is doing this? And more importantly, why haven't we heard of her before? Because she had never wanted credit. She wanted change. And for that, she needed fear. Not just in Ethan's eyes, but in every man who had ever commodified innocence. The Mistress was no longer dismantling systems, she was redesigning them. Her vision was not utopia, it was balance, power repurposed, information re-owned by the betrayed. Still, the risk was immense. For the first time, she had placed herself in the light, even if momentarily. Her name was now in encrypted chats among intelligence officers, in redacted emails, in the margins of handwritten notes passed between diplomats. She had become a ghost they could no longer ignore, and ghosts make people desperate. She felt it. The tightening of the net, the surveillance spikes, the pattern of tails in foreign cities. One slip, and the empire she built could collapse. But she had prepared for this. She had buried her identity beneath 7 layers of fiction. She had trained her mind to expect betrayal, even from those closest to her. There was no turning back. The final phase had begun. And as she stood atop a rooftop in Vienna, watching the city below flicker like a circuit board, she understood that she was now both arsonist and architect. The world might never know her name, but it would remember the moment it changed. The day the untouchables were touched. The day silence was weaponized. The day the invisible coup began. And
for all its promise, power has no warmth. It does not embrace. It does not console. It expands, and in doing so, consumes. The Mistress had achieved what most only fantasize about: global influence without identity, respect born not of applause, but of awe. She had silenced titans, collapsed facades, and rewritten the rules of engagement. But now, in the absence of chaos, she was left with silence. And silence, when you've buried everything else, becomes unbearable. The aftermath of the Orion Initiative collapse was swift and surreal. Philanthropic events vanished overnight. Major donors issued denials with trembling hands. Government inquiries were launched and then stalled under mysterious circumstances. The public, hungry for spectacle, devoured the leaks, never realizing that the hand feeding them was guided by a single mind. To most, the Mistress remained a myth. But to those at the top, she was a signal that no one was untouchable anymore. But with that signal came danger. Retaliation arrived not with bombs or bullets, but with subtlety. A data trail forged to implicate her in a cyber attack she never committed. A forged love letter leaked online to tie her to an imprisoned dictator. 2 operatives in her network vanished in Johannesburg. A safe house in Istanbul was compromised. For the first time, the empire she had built began to fracture, not from within, but from the outside forces she had shaken awake. Trust, once her weapon, began to rot. One night, her closest strategist, a woman who once escaped execution, in a failed regime, looked at her and asked, "How much longer until we become what we fight?" The question lingered, because the Mistress had once promised herself she was nothing like Ethan, or those who ran Orion, or the predators in tuxedos. But the line had blurred. She now dealt in manipulation, in secrecy, in the weaponization of narrative. Was it justice, or just a more elegant cruelty? She thought of Alina, The girl who had once cried into cracked phone screens, who had once begged the world to believe her. That girl had died. But sometimes, in the quiet between operations, the mistress swore she could hear her, like a whisper caught in an encrypted file, a voice not of doubt but of longing. And then came the letter, handwritten, no signature, delivered by a courier with no return route. Inside, a single phrase: "You taught us how to fight. Now, let us decide why." It was from one of her own, one of the many voices she had elevated, weaponized, and depended on. And it was a warning that if she became too centralized, too absolute, her own creation would turn against her, just like the world had turned on its kings. So she made a decision. She began dissolving control, carefully, strategically, transferring pieces of the archive to trusted cells, allowing others to steer operations, removing her direct involvement. The mistress would no longer be a single point of power. She would become a philosophy, a method, a ghost too fluid to be caged, even by those who loved her. It was the most dangerous move she had ever made. In relinquishing control, she risked exposure, betrayal, collapse. But it was also the only path to survival, not of herself, but of the movement she'd birthed. Because revolutions built around individuals die with them, but ones built on silence, resilience, and shared memory, they endure. Ethan, meanwhile, had become a recluse, a man uninvited to his own legacy. His name now appeared on articles tagged controversial, under investigation, former billionaire. He spent his days trying to undo the myth that destroyed him. But myths, once believed, are impossible to kill. He hired shamans, sued the press, paid hackers to unearth her identity. Nothing worked. He had wounded a woman and awoken a world. Back in her penthouse, the mistress stood before her screens, watching her empire live without her, watching others speak in her code, move in her patterns, ignite in her name. And she realized this was the plan all along, not to be remembered, but to make forgetting impossible. She shut off the lights, opened the window, let the rain hit her face, and for the first time in years, she felt something like peace. When legends fall silent, the world doesn't collapse. It holds its breath. It waits. In the absence of the mistress, a strange stillness blanketed the network she once ruled. No final message, no digital farewell. One day she was everywhere, the heartbeat beneath revolutions, the whisper in boardrooms, the echo in secrets, and the next she was gone. The void was not empty, it was electric. In the first weeks, her closest lieutenants assumed it was strategic, a test, a maneuver. Silence, after all, had always been her sharpest blade. But as days turned to weeks, a subtle panic began to fester. Operations slowed. Messages went unanswered. The archive began to restrict access through automated protocols she'd built for emergency containment. She had vanished by design, and no one knew whether to preserve her legacy or prepare to dismantle it. Outside, the world noticed. Whispers of her absence leaked into closed forums. Intelligence agencies began probing again, emboldened by the vacuum. Media analysts theorized her myth had served its time, replaced now by newer, noisier threats. And somewhere in the margins of failed states and faltering corporations, men like Ethan Voss dared to hope. Hope that the ghost had passed, that the terror in stilettos had turned human again. But they didn't understand. The mistress was never a woman. She was an evolution. Still, without her presence, fractures appeared. Internal rivalries intensified among her former network. Some wanted to honor her silence, maintaining her structure without change. Others believed her disappearance signaled weakness, an opportunity to steer the empire in their own image. A split began to form. On one side, the keepers. On the other, the catalysts. The keepers preserved her codes, her encryption rituals, her rhythm of discretion. They continued operations as if she were watching. They whispered her principles in encrypted briefings, invoking her name like scripture. The catalysts, by contrast, wanted to scale, to weaponize the brand. They saw in her legacy not restraint, but potential. They began courting new alliances, louder, riskier, more profitable. Conflicts flared. A compromised operation in Nairobi led to civilian casualties, the kind of recklessness she would never have tolerated. A former ally sold partial access to the archive to a black market data broker in Dubai. And in Paris, a journalist who once idolized the Mistress published a scathing exposé claiming the empire had become the very monster it vowed to destroy. Across all of this, one question pulsed like a wound. Where is she? Only one person knew. Far from the cities and screens, Alina walked along the cliffs of a northern island, hair tangled in salt wind, body stripped of symbol. No armor, no code name, just a woman, tracing the shoreline with bare feet, watching the tide erase her footprints. She didn't flee, she released. Power, she had learned, is most dangerous when it starts to need you, when your creation forgets you were ever real. She had built an empire designed to outlive her, but could it survive forgetting her purpose? She wrote nothing, spoke to no one. Her mind was not empty, but detoxing, cleansing itself from years of subterfuge, vengeance, and control. At night, she dreamed of cities burning and of Ethan weeping into his shattered reflection. But when she awoke, there was no rage, only the ache of something unfinished. Because deep in the archive, encrypted behind 6 fail-safes, lay one final protocol, Black Crown, the last domino, a file that, if triggered, would collapse everything, the networks, the operatives, the records, total erasure. It was her final gift to herself, the power to end what she started. Should the machine ever become the monster? But she hadn't activated it, not yet. Instead, she waited, watched from a distance as her legacy teetered between myth and distortion. And she asked herself, is survival enough? Or must meaning be enforced? Then, one night, a signal. An old protocol flared to life. One designed to activate only under a specific condition. An attempted assassination of a keeper. It had happened in Santiago. One of her own had nearly been silenced for refusing to sell intel. Someone had declared open season on the remnants of her empire. She looked out at the sea one last time, and then she turned back. Return is not redemption, not when the world you built has become a stranger. For the Mistress, reappearing was not a dramatic event, it was a calibration. A course correction born not from guilt, but from necessity. She had stepped away to preserve the idea of herself. Now, she stepped back in to protect what it had become. The Santiago attack had crossed a line she had vowed would never be tested. One of her original keepers, a woman who once risked everything to protect a whistleblower, was left for dead outside a hotel room, her encrypted watch broken. Her last message, a desperate string of numbers. It wasn't just a threat. It was a message. Someone had begun the process of erasing her legacy by force. She couldn't allow it. In 36 hours, the Mistress reactivated protocols long considered dormant. Satellite scramblers shifted frequency, digital identities masked behind AI-generated camouflage. The archive pulsed again, this time under her direct command. She wasn't just reclaiming her role. She was preparing a purge. Her first move wasn't in public. It was surgical. She confronted a high-ranking catalyst operative in a neutral villa outside Lucerne. No bodyguards, no weapons. Just 2 chairs, one truth. The woman, once a loyal disciple, had begun auctioning fragments of the archive to the highest bidder. Governments, corporations, rival networks. She had tried to scale what was never meant to grow. and she had underestimated the quiet brutality of the one who created it. She vanished the next day. It wasn't a warning, it was a precedent. From there, the mistress began mapping the infection. Not everyone who deviated had done so with malice. Some were simply misled, blinded by opportunity, but the machine was no longer functioning as designed. The lines between revolution and commerce had blurred. The mistress hadn't returned to punish. She had returned to restore integrity, and she knew it would cost her what little humanity remained. She sent a single broadcast, encrypted, untraceable, embedded in code, to all remaining operatives. This is not revival. This is reckoning. Those who remember why we began, stay. The rest, vanish. It caused a rupture. Some deleted themselves from the network within minutes. Others doubled down, activating dormant projects in her name, hoping to prove loyalty. A few rebelled, openly trying to expose her reemergence, but they forgot something vital. The mistress never returned unprepared. For every possible betrayal, she had built a silent countermeasure. Her reappearance wasn't improvisation, it was the final phase of a plan written years ago. Meanwhile, the world outside noticed strange signals again. Stock markets reacted to invisible threats. Encrypted documents began to leak, not scandals, but corrections. False narratives exposed, framed rebels exonerated, fabricated charges against enemies of power suddenly dissolved. She was cleansing the world, not with noise, but with precision, one lie at a time. Voss watched all this from the shadows of obscurity. His downfall was complete, yet he still followed her movements, obsessed with the shape of her return. When he heard whispers of her resurgence, he reached out to the one person he thought might have access, a disgraced journalist she once protected. His message was short, desperate. If you see her, tell her I understand now. No reply ever came, because understanding for men like Ethan always arrives too late. The mistress had moved beyond him. He was no longer part of her war. He was a relic, useful only as a reference point for those who would try to become him. Back in her mountain command, she looked out over her screens and saw something she hadn't expected. Order. Not fear, not chaos, but something resembling clarity. Those who remained with her did so by choice, not because of her power, but because of what it meant. Still, she knew this couldn't last. The very design of her empire was impermanence. If she stayed too long, she'd become the thing she had sworn to dismantle. So, she began drafting the final chapter. A distributed network that would no longer need a leader. An algorithm of conscience, not code. Her final act wouldn't be to vanish, but to become truly unnecessary, and yet part of her ached. She stood before the servers that held the archive and thought of Alina, the girl who had once believed love could conquer betrayal, who had once thought revenge would feel like justice, who had once just wanted to be seen. Alina was gone, and what replaced her had rewritten the world. But in that quiet room, rain still falling, lightning crawling over the peaks, the mistress made one final promise. No empire will outlive its origin lie, not while I still breathe. There is no crescendo in true endings, no applause, only silence that settles after the final chord, and in that silence, truth finally breathes. For the mistress, there was no need for a last stand, no need for a dramatic final act. Her empire had already served its purpose. What came now was the shedding of everything that tied her to the myth, and to the girl who once believed that justice had a face. She initiated the Sable Protocol at midnight. It was her final algorithm, designed not to erase, but to release. Over the course of 6 hours, the archive decoupled itself from her direct control. Layers of command dissolved. Decision-making was distributed among autonomous microcells across 23 cities. Encrypted caches were given to civilians, unaware they held pieces of a vast legacy. No single person could now destroy or control it. It was alive and unknowable. In one server, hidden beneath a sanctuary in southern Chile, the last visual trace of her was stored. A photo, never published, taken long before she became what the world feared. Alina, standing by a window, holding a book she never finished. That image was never meant for exposure, only for memory. Because sometimes what endures must be protected not through secrecy, but through letting go. And so she vanished again, not as a ghost, but as a whisper in systems that no longer needed her name. The world adapted quickly. News cycles moved on. The media speculated about her final days, theories ranging from martyrdom to political asylum, from AI illusion to orchestrated suicide. None of it mattered. Her fingerprints had been scrubbed clean. No one could prove she existed. Yet every reform, every confession that followed in her wake bore her absence like a watermark. The keepers continued quietly, no longer invoking her, just acting. Schools were rebuilt in war zones. Blackmail archives were destroyed once exposed. Those in power learned to hesitate before silencing the weak, not because they feared her return, but because they now feared themselves. Her greatest victory wasn't destruction, it was conscience, seeded where it once had no soil. Voss, stripped of relevance and wealth, lived out his final years on an island estate, occasionally interviewed by fringe journalists trying to reignite interest in his fall. When asked about the Mistress, he would only whisper, "She wasn't real, she was the mirror." And then he would go silent, lost in memory, not of power, but of a woman who once believed him. Elsewhere, in alleyways and archives, in quiet rooms and secret networks, her philosophy endured, not as a command, but as a question. What are you willing to become to protect what you love? That question no longer belonged to Alina, it belonged to the world, because the Mistress was never about vengeance. She was about reclamation, of narrative, of dignity, of silence turned into action. And though her story would be retold 1,000 different ways, in whispers, in books, in encrypted myths, no version would fully capture the weight of her solitude or the clarity of her mission. That was her final legacy, not to be known, but to make forgetting impossible. In a nameless village, a woman with unfamiliar eyes walks into a marketplace. She wears no rings, no codes. She smiles gently, asks for bread, pays in cash. The vendor doesn't recognize her. Why would he? She's no one. And that is her power now, not to disappear, but to finally live.